Hello everyone, Alexa Dunn here, and today we are talking about self-editing, which is an essential skill that you need to develop as a aspiring / professional writer. People ask me for advice on self-editing all the time, or really on editing and revision, and this is a huge messy topic that is tricky to tackle, and I do have some separate videos on revision specifically, which I will link to down below. You need to tackle this topic from many levels, and today's specific discussion of how to self-edit is about developing the skill set of approaching editing yourself and editing yourself well, and some of the things you want to pay attention to and learn. Really, the key to self-editing is you learn how to self-edit by self-editing. You learn by doing, but I'm hoping to give you some tools for your toolkit so that you can approach it in as kind of deliberate and as organized a fashion as possible. If you've seen my video about how I don't advise that you hire a freelance editor before querying, i.e. if you're pursuing traditional publishing, that feeds into this, because part of my reasoning for that is if you are going to be a professional writer, really of any kind, but let's focus on traditional publishing in this brief moment space, you have to be able to self-edit because your publisher isn't going to do anything for you. They're going to deliver to you an edit letter telling you overarchingly what the issues are, and they're going to expect you to fix it. They also aren't going to buy anything that is really messy on a prose level. Same thing with agents. They're not going to sign you if your draft is really messy. And while of course you will do a line edit pass and a copy edit pass with your publisher, they expect you to have the ability to create reasonably clean prose. The line edit pass and the copy edit pass are to clean up normal human errors, not to take something that is a flaming garbage fire of a draft and put it on bookshelves. So learning to self-edit and take care of these base level things yourself, and of course then to developmentally edit your own book, because ultimately we're the only ones who can edit our own books. Essential skills. Essential skills for self-publishing as well, except when you're doing self-publishing, it does behoove you to hire a freelance editor to fulfill the same role that an editor at a traditional publisher would, i.e. giving you an edit letter so you can do your own developmental edit, doing line edits, doing copy edits, etc. So either way, you need to learn to self-edit. And okay, so what does this mean? What are the levels that we're going to talk about? So the big thing really is developmental. Learning to self-edit means that you learn to identify issues in your manuscript or respond to others identifying issues in your manuscript, and you come up with the solutions for those problems. You dig into your draft and you do real editing, real revision, deep revision, not just surface edits. And the next type I'm going to talk about is what I mean by surface edits. You still have to learn how to do these surface edits, but they're separate from developmental edits. So the surface edits are line edits and copy edits. You also do need to learn how to do these things yourself. Line edits is sentence level, prose level things. There's lots of kind of things you can identify on a prose level, and then copy edits is grammar and usage. These two things go together, like looking at the nitty-gritty of your prose. You do have to learn how to do that yourself as well. But I'm going to mostly be talking about developmental edits in this video. But I don't want to leave you hanging on line edits and copy edits. So read that prose level stuff, the grammar and usage stuff. You're always going to be leveling up and improving your skills here. I'll tell you, working with my professional editor at my traditional publisher, notes that she gave me on my line edits set off light bulbs for me about my own writing tics and habits, and I have been actively working on certain things in my writing. So you're always improving your ability to spot and edit yourself on a line and copy level. Where learning to self-edit on this level is going to help you is that eventually you should be correcting some of the issues in your writing at the drafting stage where you no longer make the same mistakes. So learning to self-edit on a line and copy basis is just about leveling up your writing overall on kind of that sentence level prose grammar usage basis. The cleaner, more concise, more interesting your prose, the better off you are overall. It's essentially useless to do deep developmental edits if your prose level writing isn't working. So you do have to learn to self-edit in these two different areas in concert with each other. I'll say most novice writers are going to have to learn to self-edit the line and the copy stuff first. One of my best pieces of advice for this is, I will say that early on in your writing journey, it can be very, very useful to have someone brutally line edit and copy edit your first couple of chapters. This could be a really brutally honest CP. It could even be, in some cases, hiring a freelance editor. Again, I'm not suggesting you hire a freelance editor before you query, but I do know some people have found extreme value in hiring a professional editor to tear apart some of their work so that they see what the problems are. For me, some of my most brutal early edits, line edits and copy edits, came from beta readers when I was writing fan fiction and kind of encountering those things head on as a much younger writer with writing that had less kind of heft to it, meaning I wasn't trying to get published. I kind of dealt with my feelings then about how dare this person call out my dialogue tags, and then I was able to learn that she was right and my dialogue tags were awful. And I had to fix it, and I kind of was able to level up and learn to self-edit those things early on so that by the time I was writing original work, it wasn't there anymore. And really, that's why I do this channel and I do a lot of the videos on this channel, to identify some of these like kind of writing 101, craft, prose, line level issues so that you can start to recognize those things in your work as well. So the first step of learning to self-edit is to ingest as much information as you can about these common writing mistakes that you might be making, and then learning to identify them in your own work and fixing them. You can watch videos like mine or other AuthorTube channels, you can read craft books. There are a lot of different ways to kind of engage with the topic of these things and then start self-editing them. And just a quick list of some things you might want to look out for that do kind of come up when in terms of learning how to edit the 101 kind of line edit copy things include passive voice, varying your sentence structure, adverb abuse / poor use of adverbs, adjective abuse, messy dialogue tags, telling over showing, filtering, echoes, which is repeating words a lot on the same page or section or overall. Also crutch words fall under this. Purple prose, overwriting, as well as info dumping. These are some things that if you learn to self-edit and correct and fix these things, you will be in a much better position with your work overall. Which brings me to developmental editing. Whew, so this is the big one. When you become more experienced, for your first major edit of your book, you aren't even going to need someone externally to tell you what the problems are in the work, to identify them for you. But when you're first starting out, it is essential to get other opinions, to kind of learn to step back from your own work and see what other people are seeing. So having beta readers and critique partners early on in the process is really, really critical, because you need to learn to receive feedback, assess critical feedback, and then turn it into action, i.e. editing. Then over time, most professional writers, we develop our own sixth sense where we can see the issues in our own work before we're even finished writing the book sometimes, and then we already have a plan of action for doing one major developmental overhaul before we bring in any critique partners or agent or turn in anything to our editor. But learning how to self-edit on this level does take time and development. So I'm going to talk a bit more about how to work with critique partners. So what's really critical is learning how to assess feedback. And the first thing is to consider the source. This is where it gets tricky because you want to have people reading your work who know what they're talking about, essentially. So who doesn't make a great early reader for your work in terms of critical assessment and learning to self-edit? Well, people who love you generally aren't going to give you the best feedback. So that's family members, that's friends, that's a boyfriend or a girlfriend or partner. Generally, they're going to tell you they love it. They're going to give you cheerleader reads. And generally speaking, if you're sending out your work for critique and everyone tells you it's great, you probably need new critique partners. No one writes a perfect thing on a first draft, and even great books have some things that you can do with them, work to be done on them. So you want to find good critique partners who know how to deliver good feedback, not just being harsh and mean, but saying, I'm feeling like this is a problem, and hopefully they can actually tell you why. Because understanding why people say something about a book, that they were bored or they didn't connect to a character, and sometimes that's all the feedback you're going to get. But if you find someone early on who can articulate why they feel things about your book, that's going to help you with self-editing. Because in coming up with solutions and how to fix things, it's not just the what, it's the why that you have to figure out. I have a whole video on finding critique partners and working with critique partners and assessing critical feedback. I have multiple videos, so I'm gonna link to those down below. But I will reiterate from those videos as well that the next step when you send out your work for critique, the next step in becoming better at self-editing is to tamp down your defensiveness. We're always going to feel defensive when we get any kind of critical feedback on our work. This will never stop. You'll get better at dealing with it. So when I first get my edit letters from my editor, I'm always a little bit defensive, even though I'm a professional at this point, and I know that none of it's personal, and I always work through it, and then I tend to do 90% of the notes because I'm like, they were right. I was just real mad about it for like 12 hours. And that's natural to feel those feelings and be like, oh, they just don't understand. So you need to learn to control that, to have your moments of feelings and then put it aside and look at your work objectively. You need to try to see what they're seeing and look at your work the way that an outsider would. If you don't open yourself up to criticism and learn to process it, you're never going to grow as a writer, because critically engaging with your own work is an essential part of being a good, developing, growing writer, and it's an essential part of self-editing, because this brings me to actually self-editing. So as you get feedback from people, you're going to have your feelings, then hopefully you're going to be open to their ideas, and you're going to start to dissect what people actually mean when they're giving you feedback about your book. Like I said, you have to figure out the why, and if you're lucky, you find people who actually tell you the why. Though I will say, many times, they also try to tell you the how, which is how you should fix something. And a lot of the time they're wrong. Never feel obligated to do what someone is telling you to do. But I will also say, every once in a while, you get that magic critique partner or agent or editor who is just a whiz at story, and sometimes their hows are brilliant, and you should actually listen to them. I'm never more thankful than when someone goes, well, what if you did this? And I go, that's genius, and I never would have thought about it. That actually happened for me with The Stars Be Still. I was trying to solve a problem in my first act, and a friend of mine said, what about speed dating? She's a genius. Now there's speed dating. I was like, this is so perfect. So you never know when someone else's idea is going to be the right idea for fixing things. So I'm going to tell you, the first couple times you try to revise as you're learning self-editing, you're going to be fumbling a little. Your edits are going to be more cosmetic generally. You're not necessarily going to be good at digging in and throwing stuff out and really identifying the problems and digging in to fix them. Essentially, getting feedback and reacting to it and implementing it poorly or mediocrely is how you will actually learn to self-edit well, because you'll produce subsequent drafts and go, oh, I'm not solving it. But if you're astute and you're open to learning, you will start to see patterns in your own writing, things that people are suggesting and bringing up, and you'll start to identify your weaknesses as a writer. So this is an essential part of self-editing, because you have to understand yourself, understand your own writing, not get too mad at yourself about it, but seek out solutions for fixing the weaknesses that you do have. And so then you have to start focusing on the hows, the whys and the hows. And you do this by, again, it's you putting in a lot of your own work, investigating things that come up often with kind of what I call 201 writing problems. So meaning they're not the kind of 101 prose level problems that you're dealing with when you're learning how to line edit and copy edit yourself, but they are the 201 problems that tend to come up when you're learning how to do developmental edits yourself. And some of them are pacing, murky or kind of insufficient conflict and stakes, lack of proper tension on a story or a scene or act level, white room syndrome, character agency, emotional arcs, character growth, character soup / character function, you have too many or too few characters, usually too many, scene function, so scenes that are boring and don't do anything, which usually comes back to conflict, stakes, and tension, and foreshadowing. And I have videos on almost all of these things. I will link to a bunch of them down below. But meaning it's the same advice here for developmental editing and learning to self-edit as it is for line edit and copy editing. You need to start investigating these things and looking into them yourself and educating yourself essentially on all of these craft elements and things that can impact story. You need to learn what they are and start to identify them in other storytelling. Once you kind of know, all right, I have a problem with pacing, so who are authors who do amazing pacing in my genre? I'm going to read their books. You start to recognize plot beats and tropes and ways that they solve story problems. Of course, you don't know what the original problem was, but you're reading and you go, oh, that twist was brilliant. That really surprised me, or that moment in this scene really engaged me. And so you're essentially ingesting as much information as you can about what makes good story work, and then figuring out how to implement that in your own writing. And so I know what you're thinking. You're thinking, Alexa, I wanted a checklist of exactly what I need to do to learn to self-edit. And I'm telling you that it is a fumbling, holistic process. But here, I do have some concrete steps to take. So this is assuming you're kind of figuring out how to self-edit. So the first thing you need to do, you have your book, you know there are problems. You need to identify what the top line problems actually are. You need to learn to name them, such as pacing, foreshadowing, and any of the other things I just mentioned or anything I failed to mention that you know you have an issue with. Here's the thing. Sometimes these are deceptive. You can hear pacing, but your real problem is character agency. Or you can hear, I was bored, and your real problem is character agency. Agency is actually a huge problem. I should have mentioned that one on the list. So step one is to hear the problem, figure out what the problem actually is, figure out what you've done in your book, why it's not working, and then think of concrete things to change and fix in the story that will make it work better. None of this is easy. The next step is to develop a plan. So this is when you are actually concretely sitting down to revise. Again, revision is its whole own beast, and I will link down below to some videos I have on revision. But if you are a newer writer, if you're in the earlier stages of learning to self-edit, you're probably going to need to tackle your revision in multiple rounds. And for this, I recommend focusing on some of the biggest overarching problems, the ones that will impact your story the most, and doing a revision pass on those things first. Then you can go back and do other revision rounds dealing with all of the ripples and anything else you want to fix. Overall, I'll tell you a pacing edit or a character growth or agency edit will usually impact the story the most, or if you're literally changing what happens in the story, obviously that's going to change the story the most. So tackle those big overarching revisions first before you overwhelm yourself trying to tackle everything all at once. And then the next thing you need to do, you've developed your plan, you're doing the thing. And this is killing your darlings. So this is easier said than done. And this is where, as I mentioned, when you're first starting to learn to self-edit, you're usually going to do more cosmetic passes, and you're not going to do this very thing. And that thing is throwing out work. Because the key to being good at self-editing, being good at revision, is to learn to not be as precious about your own work. Because when you've identified a problem and you have figured out what you did that isn't working, and you have a solution for how to fix it, you're gonna have to throw stuff out. It can mean throwing out your favorite line from a chapter. It can be throwing out an entire scene that you had so much fun writing, but it just doesn't serve the story at all. It can be throwing out a chapter. It can be throwing out the majority of an act. And in some extreme cases, some people do rewrite their books from scratch, but that is a horror I have not personally experienced, and I don't even want to fathom right now or scare you. But meaning you have to learn to throw out anything that isn't working and replace it with something else. It's always painful in the moment, especially because drafting can be so hard. We're so proud of ourselves for doing something, and as we're looking at something we want to throw out, we want to delete, we go, I worked so hard that day, and I hit my goal count, and blah, blah, blah. You have to consider everything that came before in writing a book it's a different you, it's a different experience. You have to always look at your book as it is in the moment, being as objective as you can. It doesn't matter how you feel about this chapter. If it's not working, it's gone. Just a huge part of learning to self-edit and being good at it is being brutal with yourself over your own writing and, not being precious about anything. But on the flip side, the next thing that you need to focus on and think about when you are self-editing is learning when self-editing isn't working very well. There's always going to be a moment in your revision and your self-editing where you hate everything and you're no longer able to see anything good on the page. And so you do need to bring in outside reinforcements very often. Now, you still ultimately are the person who needs to edit your book, but sometimes when you are in the thick of it, you lose your confidence essentially. You start hating everything. You go from being precious about your writing to hating everything. So the number one is sometimes the key with self-editing is taking a break. Stepping back from the work so you can get your objectivity back. The other thing is bringing in your reinforcements. This is why it is important to have trusted critique partners who can read things, especially read new things that you've done. This can hit you especially when you are doing a big fix. You're like making a major change to your book and your like confident core tells you you've got it. This is the fix, this is the book, and you're doing it and then you go, oh no, this is awful, this is garbage, I've changed everything, why did I do this? So bring in your critique partners, have them read over what you do, and have them there to reassure you. This is a point where the cheerleader feedback is actually good for you. There are always going to be points in the self-editing process where you just need reassurance, so make sure that you have a team who will work with you. Because really the secret to self-editing, the catch-22, of self-editing is that you're never actually by yourself when you're editing. Editing doesn't happen in a vacuum. You are the only person who can actually do it because it's your book. Your agent isn't gonna write your book for you, your editor isn't gonna write your book for you, but they're there with you as you do go through this process. Pre-publication, it's your critique partners. Create a support system who are there with you to work on this book to get you through edits. This is especially important when you are kind of in the earlier stages of learning to self-edit. Having a support team there for you can help you sort of figure out jerk brain. Like, when are you going into the moments where you're basically just being mean to yourself and psyching yourself out? I will say over time, I need my critique partners a little less at certain moments because I can basically slap myself in the face and go, no, that's your jerk brain talking. This is fine, keep going. So it's just kind of developing resilience and confidence, but also humility and kind of learning to do these things in concert. So learning to self-edit isn't easy. Getting good at it isn't easy. You can only get better at it by doing it, by having great critique partners, by being open to criticism, learning as much about craft as you can. And I know that sounds dry and boring, but it's what we each have to do. I will say I'm a huge proponent of learning craft by just reading. Reading a ton of successfully published books that figured this stuff out and did it well, can kind of help you to learn the story stuff by osmosis. I mean, similarly, also sometimes you'll read a book and go, I don't think it does this well at all, and seeing the flaws in other people's writing can also help you learn to edit your own writing. So my last tip for learning to self-edit is to be a critique partner. Be a good critique partner. Read other people's work and learn to identify the what's in their writing and be that good critique partner who also identifies the why, and occasionally be the critique partner who comes up with a great how. As you do this for other people, you're gonna get better at doing it for yourself. So that is my rambly, holistic guide to how to self-edit. The conclusion being, it's an art, not a science, and you just kind of have to stumble through it and learn it by doing. Whew. Let me know down below in the comments if you have questions, or if you are an expert at self-editing, what are your tips? How would you advise a person to get better at self-editing? I'm curious to know, because I challenged myself to sit down and put this together, and that's when I realized it's so complicated. It's really hard to explain. Art, not a science. Give this video a thumbs up if you liked it, and I will make more videos on kind of the holistic writing, editing, and growing as a writer process. Subscribe to the channel if you're not already. I post new videos 2 to 3 times a week. Thank you so much for watching. Good luck with editing, everyone, and as always, Happy writing!